Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome along to the What the Israeli Papers Say, our 7th edition of the What the Israeli Papers Say here at Real Israel. My name is Paul Alster. I'm a broadcast journalist here in Israel, and I'm delighted to say that we have two very special guests here to join us to look at the news that's been happening in this region over the last week or so. First up, Steve Linde joins us. We're delighted to have Steve here. He's the former editor-in-chief, of course, of the Jerusalem Post. He's one of Israel's most senior English-language journalists and broadcasters with a background in radio broadcasting as well in Israel. And he's the current editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Report magazine. So, Steve, very good to have you with us. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me, Paul.
It's a pleasure. And with us, back for more, like a moth to a flame, Benjamin Weinthal joins us. He's the European affairs correspondent for the Jerusalem Post. He's a fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington and is also a regular contributor to a number of mainstream and major German news outlets. So, Benjamin, thanks very much for joining us once again.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
Well, a lot's been happening in the world over the last week. On our last show, we were wondering what was going to happen in the US elections. We're going to come to that in just a moment because it does have some bearing on our first story, which has been selected by Benjamin. And this is the story of the Trump's administration's decision to sell some 50 F-35 jets to the United Arab Emirates. Now, Benjamin, this obviously is a significant development, and this is a story that, as you'll see on the screen, has been covered widely. We've selected a couple of outlets, Ynet, Yediot Ahronot's online version, and the Jerusalem Post as well. Benjamin, your thoughts on whether this is a good thing for the region, these 50 F-35s going to the UAE?
Well, initially, the Netanyahu administration was publicly opposed to the $25 billion deal that, as you mentioned, would send 50 advanced F-35 fighter jets to the UAE, largely because one of Israel's tenets in terms of security is to maintain a qualitative military edge in the region. In fact, U.S. law back in 2008 codified a provision that states Israel should maintain a qualitative military edge in the Middle East, and these types of deals could potentially jeopardize that edge. So the U.S. State Department yesterday said, that is Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, or the other day, that this deal won't jeopardize Israel's qualitative military edge. But the U.S. Senate wants a review of the deal, and outgoing Congressman Eliot Engel from the Bronx in New York City has requested a review of the deal. He's a congressman, and there are question marks over whether this could create a level playing field that could jeopardize, as I mentioned, Israel's qualitative military edge. So the jury's still out, and there are big question marks over the deal.
And obviously, there's the question mark of the new relationship with the UAE is obviously a very positive one for Israel, but nobody can see into the future. We don't know how long that relationship is going to last. And Steve, would it be something that gives you a pause for thought, this deal? Would it be something that you'd be in favor of, or do you think they need to look at it again before everything goes through?
Well, Paul, as a journalist, I try not to take stands on deals like this, whether I'm for or against. It has been of concern, as Benny said, because of Israel's qualitative military edge, the QME, as it's called. And it has caused some controversy here in Israel because the opposition claimed that Israel tacitly approved this deal as part of its peace agreements with the UAE and Bahrain. Mm-hmm. So, yes, it's clearly a concern. I don't think that Israel needs to be concerned about F-35s or any other jets being in the hands of the UAE or anyone else for that matter, so long as they're friendly. I think that the problem becomes, of course, when such regimes decide that they're no longer Israel's friends anymore. But certainly the indications are that nothing will change under the Biden administration, and Joe Biden will certainly honor the deals made between the Trump administration and the UAE and Bahrain. I see no reason for them to go against these agreements. And if all goes well, this deal will lead the way to more agreements between Israel and Arab states. Again, it's all a matter of what the Biden administration's policy will be. But if it continues on the path laid out by the Trump administration, we can expect to see further deals between Israel and other Arab countries in the future, and perhaps even Saudi Arabia, which I think is the ultimate goal.
Well, that obviously will be a fascinating development if it were to come to pass. But I want to come back in just a few moments to the extension of this story, but touching on the fact that it is almost certain there's going to be a change of administration in the United States. And obviously, a lot of people felt that Trump was a good thing for Israel. Others weren't quite so sure. But the man that's going to take over, Joe Biden, obviously he's been involved in the past in this region. But you had the opportunity, Steve, to meet him some 6 years ago. And I'm just really interested to hear about your personal impressions of the man and whether you think he's somebody that Israel can rely on 100% to do the right thing by us.
Yes, I met him on the sidelines of the General Assembly, the so-called GA of Jewish federations in America. It was held in Washington, D.C., and I went backstage to meet him after his speech to the federations. And he said something which I'll never forget and which will stay with me, and I shared on social media. He said that we, at the time it was the Obama administration, support you, being Israel, here, and here, and he punched me in the chest. And so I'll never forget that expression. He's a very warm, charismatic man, and I found him to be truthful and genuine. I certainly have no reason to question that, but I should note that my Facebook post sharing this information has received a lot of venomous, poisonous responses, if you like, most of which I've tried not to read, but there certainly are a lot of people out there, including my friends on Facebook, who are clearly not supporters of Joe Biden and remain staunch supporters of Donald Trump.
Well, of course, Joe Biden's association as vice president with Barack Obama, people will remember that to a great extent, Barack Obama wasn't such a positive force in the Middle East. The America did support Israel properly during that time, but Benjamin, during the Obama period, he misunderstood the Middle East in a big style. He really did misunderstand how things work here. Are you optimistic that Joe Biden will have learned from the errors or the misunderstandings of that time and will be a more positive force as a Democratic president?
Well, I think that's the 800-pound gorilla question in the room. It depends on who. One factor is what figures Biden brings into his administration. For example, are these folks who are going to support the return to the Iran deal, the joint, also known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that was vehemently opposed by the Israeli government. There are elements within the Democratic Party and the Democratic policy world that want a return to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. That would be opposed by the Netanyahu administration. I think, as Steve mentioned, Biden would probably build on the agreements with the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, even, one would hope try to establish diplomatic relations with other friendly Sunni countries in the Gulf, like Oman, which is that we see on Steve's shirt. It reminded me of
Yes.
Iran as a potential candidate for diplomatic relations. Also, Morocco might be a possibility, maybe even before Trump departs. But again, these strands or elements within the Biden circles who are favor Obama's view that there should be a balance of power in the region and that Iran should be a balance or part of that balance of power, that is the Islamic Republic of Iran, is a highly, highly dangerous policy. I would imagine the Israeli defense and security establishment, including the Netanyahu administration, would vehemently oppose trying to bring in the Iranian regime from the cold.
Well, I did read just a little bit earlier on today. I don't know how reliable it is, but there seems to be talk in the United States that Michelle Flournoy is a possible Secretary of Defense appointment by Joe Biden. If that's the case, she was very outspoken against Iran in the past, and she was also very critical of Barack Obama not taking action in Syria and not defending the red line that had been placed there. So if she is put on the team by Biden, I suspect that in Israel, Steve, people might see that as a positive sign that they are going to have a sort of steel fist in a velvet glove approach to Iran. She could be a very positive appointment, I think, if she is made Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, Iran is top of the agenda as far as Israel is concerned. I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu made it clear during the Obama administration that he was prepared to stand up and defy the administration's policy by talking directly to Congress against the Iran deal that Benny just mentioned. But the indications are that the Biden administration will try to join that, to renew its commitment to that Iran deal. Again, it might do it in a clever, strategic way to show that it obviously opposes Iran becoming nuclear, and the deal will have all kinds of conditions, perhaps, that it did not have before. But I think people are already expressing concern in Israel that a return to this deal could be very, very harmful for Israel and for all those who see Iran as a huge threat in the Middle East, including, of course, Saudi Arabia.
Well, first of all, we have to see the administration change. And as things are going on at the moment, there's still one or two bridges to be crossed before that particular event. But I want to move on to another story, because we've been mentioning about the Netanyahu government's opposition to Iran. But of course, the Netanyahu coalition government with Benny Gantz and the blue and white is in a little bit, a very, very big problem. And Steve, I'll come to you first on this. The potential collapse of the coalition. It's what everybody's talking about here in Israel. Is Benny Gantz going to pull out, or are some members of his faction going to pull out and bring down the government? And if so, if we go to new election, what is that going to bring? Can you look into your crystal ball and give us a kind of a thought on which way we might be going?
Well, thank you for that. Another thing that I'm not very good at doing is being prophetic. But I
give it a try.
This is a serious crisis that we're now witnessing in Israel. That Benny Gantz, for the first time, is articulating the threat in public. In fact, in the Knesset plenum, that if Netanyahu and the government does not honor its agreement to pass the 2021 budget in the Knesset by the end of the year, they will in fact bolt the government, and that will lead to new elections. Now, I don't know how serious that threat is. He's been threatening that sort of behind the scenes for months now. In fact, ever since the government was formed earlier this year. But this time he does seem to be serious, and I think that people who support blue and white and who oppose what the Netanyahu government is doing see this as a make or break time for this government, this so-called unity government, because if a budget isn't passed it will be very difficult to allocate money to all kinds of things, from the fight against COVID-19 to the defense budget. And unless the budget is passed, it'll be difficult for Netanyahu to say he's honored his agreement with Blue and White, the party of Benny Gantz. And I think that will, in fact, lead to another, unfortunately, early election in Israel. We've already had 3 in the last year. And so this will be the 4th. And all the polls indicate that Netanyahu will lose power. I mean, he will still be elected prime minister, but he will lose a lot of seats in the next election. So it's not in his interest to promote this election. And it's not in Benny Gantz's interest either, because he has a very small party. And unless he unifies with other parties in the opposition, he doesn't stand a very good chance either. So it's in both men's interest not to break up the government, but who knows, anything's possible in Israel, and often the most unexpected thing happens.
Well, Gantz, certainly in the eyes of many centrists who voted for him as part of the Blue and White bloc, blotted his copybook in joining the coalition government, because the whole stance that they went to the public on was that they would not join forces with Netanyahu in any circumstances. And with 5 of his own MKs talking about breaking away, possibly going back to Yesh Atid, it's a very, very challenging time. And Benjamin Weinthal, how likely do you feel it is that this government is going to collapse, and what sort of how big is the potential chaos going to prove to be?
Well, I think my view mirrors Steve's view. That is, I don't have any predictive powers when it comes to Israeli coalition politics. It's incredibly volatile and filled with, as I mentioned, just unpredictability. But this would be the 4th election within 18 months if the coalition collapses at the end of this year. It seems as if the alternate prime minister, Benny Gantz, is pushing Netanyahu to show clarity, so the Israeli coalition can avoid a 4th election. Now, Netanyahu's position, or the thinking behind Netanyahu's position right now, is he wants to bring about a possible 4th election. This is what some commentators are saying, what we read in the Israeli press, so that the alternate prime minister, that's what Benny Gantz has been defined as in the coalition agreement, would not become prime minister next year. And Netanyahu, who's been prime minister for over 10 years, the longest serving prime minister in Israel's history, would then not be in a position of power. And that has all sorts of ramifications for his career. So there's a lot of moving parts in terms of this very complex budget agreement right now, that it moves beyond the sort of machinery of economics and trying to provide funds to the different ministries. And I think that's one problem that I've noticed in terms of these budget negotiations and all the jockeying for position is a lot of the ministries right now, as I understand it, are not receiving funds, social programs, for example.
That's right. Yes.
Youth at risk programs. So it's really not an optimal situation for the sort of grassroots level in Israel that warrants funding.
And as far as the polls that are being presented to us at the moment, the one politician that seems to be on the rise and who potentially could be a challenger to Netanyahu, depending on how the coalition cards fall, Steve, that's Naftali Bennett. Do you think he is going to be strengthened if we go into a 4th election? Are we going to see a rise of his right-wing party?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, sorry for the self-promotion, but the next issue of the Jerusalem Report will have an investigative story on Naftali Bennett and his chances of succeeding Netanyahu as prime minister. All the most recent polls have shown that there's definitely a swing from Netanyahu's Likud to Bennett's Yamina party. One poll that I read recently has the Likud at 33 seats and Bennett at 26, I believe. So he's really within distance of beating Netanyahu, especially if he's able to join forces with other parties on the right or center. So yes, I think he's a serious contender. I think that his views on the peace process are definitely much more hawkish than Netanyahu's. Yes, on the other hand, he's more liberal when it comes to social, economic issues. He certainly was very quick to come up with solutions to fight the coronavirus pandemic, solutions which the government later adopted under its corona czar, Ronnie Gamzu, who's soon to step down. But Bennett certainly is a thinker, and he's not stupid. And we have a wonderful story by Amotz Asel in the next report, which I highly recommend that people read. But yeah, self-promotion aside, he's a serious contender from the right. We have people like Yair Lapid contending from the left, or center, if you like, and there are people within Netanyahu's own Likud party who are ready to pounce as soon as he decides to step down or is forced to step down.
And in the event that Benny Gantz doesn't get his turn as Prime Minister, Benjamin, because I think a lot of people felt that when the rotation was announced, the shock was that Netanyahu was going to be taking the first turn, especially with all the criminal cases that he was facing. Most people felt the likelihood, if Gantz was smart enough to do a deal, was that he would go first, let Netanyahu go through the trial process, and then if he comes out clean, he can take the second rotation. Do you think that was the big mistake that Benny Gantz made? And do you think he's somebody that the Israeli public are going to vote for again, having changed his stance so dramatically after the last election?
Well, the critics like Yair Lapid criticized Gantz for his alleged capitulation to Netanyahu, that is just joining the coalition.
Well, it wasn't alleged. It was a capitulation because he said he wouldn't do it at the elections, didn't he? He said, I will not join any government with Netanyahu.
Right. And so he took a lot of heat for that capitulation, alleged or not. And then the question of negotiating the actual agreement, should he have gone first? It's a question of political savvy and, again, the different moving parts of the coalition agreement. I suspect he probably, again, it's a guessing game, but I suspect he had more leverage than he knew that he actually had to take the prime minister position first. We have to remember Gantz is a general,
yes.
And he comes from a military background. This is his first appearance on the sort of political world stage, both outside of Israel and in Israel. So he's dealing with a very formidable opponent, Benjamin Netanyahu, who's one of the most politically savvy politicians out there. Everyone agrees on that. That Netanyahu is a master politician. So we'll see if Gantz has picked up some experience here in terms of how this current coalition battle plays out, whether he can maneuver himself into being the next prime minister.
Well, I think this is going to come to a head fairly quickly. It has to do because, as Steve pointed out, the situation demands that either a budget is reached or we go to new elections, which I think a full set of elections. I'm not so sure how much stomach the Israeli public has for another round of going to the ballot box, but we'll see. I want to move on because a number of outlets here in Israel have been obviously following the changing sands here in the Middle East. And this week, as we'll show through the headline pieces from Haaretz and the Times of Israel, there's been the normalization ratified by the Israeli Knesset of the agreement with Bahrain. Now, this obviously is another big step in the right direction, many people see. Benjamin Weinthal, coming to you first on this. I just wondered, though, I read yesterday of the passing of the Bahraini Prime Minister, who's one of the longest serving political leaders in the Middle East. Is that going to make any difference to the constellation as regards the relationship with Bahrain?
I strongly suspect it won't, because Bahrain is a monarchy, and as opposed to being a democracy, this type of decision, normalization with Israel, doesn't have to go through the same grinding process of a democracy. Again, the strategic interest here at play, or interests, I should say, override, I think, any sort of changes within the Bahraini government along the lines that you described, the passing of the prime minister. Because, as we mentioned, to revert back to the outset of this program, the Islamic Republic of Iran remains the greatest threat, not only to Israel in the region, but to the Sunni countries. And I should have mentioned this during the outset of the conversation. The problem with this Iran nuclear deal is that Obama and Biden, the administration from Obama and Biden negotiated, there's a sunset clause. That means that after a certain period of time, the Iranian regime will be able to develop a nuclear arsenal. That means nuclear weapons. So once this agreement passes out of existence, Iran has a solid pathway to build a nuclear weapons device. And that's what fills Sunni countries like Bahrain, the UAE, Saudi Arabia with acute anxiety, because they're threatened by a dangerously jingoistic Shiite country, and they want to ally with Israel right now. So that's one part of it in terms of the normalization.
Yes. Yeah. So given all those factors, Steve, Bahrain being one of the latest, we've got an agreement with Sudan. I can't remember if that's been ratified as yet or not, but Sudan is there. You're obviously dressed to fit here with maybe a subliminal message that maybe Oman could be next on the list. Let's just look at the region and first of all go to Saudi Arabia. There are such differences in the way the Saudi Arabian nation is run and Israel. There are historically been many issues. Do you think that Iran is enough of a factor to bring the two sides together and that we can genuinely expect some sort of a deal with Saudi Arabia going forward?
Well, it should be, but, things are not so simple in the Middle East, to put it mildly. It's a complex place. And I think that the one thing we need to mention here is the Palestinians. You can't ignore the Palestinians, and the Saudis, at least publicly, are saying that they're not going to sign any deal with Israel until there's, a serious resumption of negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, that the Palestinians shouldn't be sidelined at this stage, in favor of all these wonderful deals between Israel and the Arab countries. Again, I just put this shirt on because it was the first shirt in my wardrobe this morning as I opened my eyes. But yes, Oman has publicly congratulated Israel on signing its deals with the UAE, Bahrain, and now Sudan. It hasn't been ratified yet. The signing ceremony was due to take place, I believe, last week, and it was postponed. I'm wondering that perhaps the Biden administration might want to pause and reassess the situation before moving forward on this track, because again, it's wonderful, and it shows the world that there's still a chance for peace in the Middle East. On the other hand, you can't push aside the Palestinians for much longer, and I think that Biden, and he has some very good advisors, including a man named Ron. What's his name? Ron. The one he just named as White House.
Oh, yes, Ron Cowan or something like that. I can't remember his name, but he's a guy that's been working with a number of different administrations in the past, isn't he?
Ron Klein, yeah. I just Googled
Klein,
it. So,
yes. Yeah. Well done.
He's Jewish. In fact, he's the one who took me to meet with Biden 6 years ago, and he very much believes that that the Palestinian track needs to be taken seriously. And I think that Biden might pause for a while and say, let's try and resume negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians, and then move forward with the other states. Again, there are 5 or 6 states waiting to resume normalize relations with Israel. I know that my cousin in the foreign ministry told me they've already produced flags from at least 5 countries waiting for the announcements, but maybe those announcements now will be put on hold.
Well, it's going to be very interesting. I assume countries like Morocco, that I think we mentioned at the top of the show, are possible candidates. Benjamin, just going back to you as far as the Palestinian question is concerned, we lost Sayed Barakat earlier on this week, one of the most familiar faces as negotiating on behalf of the Palestinians, respected in many parts, but also very belligerent at times, and a guy who didn't always look to seal the deal when the opportunities were there. Do you think that somebody new is going to come along on the Palestinian side, even while Mahmoud Abbas is there, to give Israel a chance of finding a partner that they can actually do business with?
Well, I think the real question, I suspect, is not who's going to be the chief Palestinian negotiator, but who will replace Abbas. And there are candidates out there. Abbas, of course, is an aged or senior citizen, I should say, who's been very slowed down lately because of health reasons, and also obviously because of the Israel's normalization process. That means the Palestinian track, as Steve mentioned, has been relegated to a secondary status. I guess I have a slightly different take than Steve, although I do think you can't dismiss or ignore the Palestinian statehood question. But I do think that if the Biden administration pursues the Trump track, that is, secures more normalization agreements, that will actually help bring about, I think, a Palestinian-Israeli negotiation and possibly statehood, because the Palestinians will then be, I think, I don't want to say locked in, but they'll have to internalize that normalization is the name of the game, and they should also seek to normalize negotiations and relations with Israel on a more advanced level. So I would prefer to see an intensification of the normalization process. Also with help, as I mentioned, I think on one of your earlier shows, Paul, with the Egyptians and the Jordanians, because I do think when the negotiations take place within the context of the region, as opposed to having all these external actors involved, for example, the European Union, you can bring about more progress.
Well, again, that's one thing. I just wanted to ask you very quickly, just a very quick answer from both of you. One of the countries I saw in 1 or 2 media reports as a potential candidate for normalization was suggested as Qatar. To me, that came as a little bit of a surprise, given their sponsorship of a number of terrorist entities and the way they've been going about all sorts of things all over the place. Steve, do you think Qatar is at all a possibility to be on the list?
Well, it's a remote possibility, but definitely a possibility. I mean, given that Israel allows Qatar to transfer millions of dollars every month to Hamas in Gaza, there's certainly been contacts, maybe not direct negotiations, but contacts between Israel and Qatar. Yes, Qatar also funds news networks like Al Jazeera, and it's certainly not seen as a friend of Israel, but it's definitely a potential mediator. And it's very proud of the ties it has, on the one hand, with Hamas and the Iranians, and on the other, with more liberal, moderate Western countries. And I think it's definitely possible that Qatar could play a surprising role in mediating, if you like. But I think it's still a remote possibility, and there are others who will come before that.
Okay, and Benjamin, would you be happy to see Qatar normalizing relations with Israel? Would you trust that kind of a relationship?
Well, I mean, I would support, of course, normalization with Qatar because Israel has diplomatic relationship with Turkey, and Turkey's a state sponsor of terrorism in terms of harboring Hamas terrorists who have launched terrorist attacks from Turkey against Israelis. So I don't. That's the question is of trust. Of course, one should distrust Qatar because Qatar is also a state sponsor of terrorism. Qatar funds Hezbollah, funds the Islamic State, funds a whole host of jihadist terrorist movements. Yes. In my view, I think the U.S. really has to crack down on Qatar and threaten to classify it as a state sponsor of terrorism unless it stops its terrorist activity. So I consider Qatar to be a highly dangerous actor in the region. But again, it's an actor that Israel should not oppose in terms of normalization.
Of course, one thing the Americans could do if they really wanted to put pressure on Qatar is to close their air base there at Al Udeid. That would certainly give the Qataris pause for thought, because that is one of their main protective elements of their nation, given all the enemies they have in the region. But I want to come to one final story. And this is a story that we keep getting time and again, different versions of it. It's to do with the United Nations and their voting record as it relates to Israel. And in the last week, 138 United Nations members have voted to call the Temple Mount, which of course one of the most holy places on earth for Jewish people, also a very major site for the Islamic faith because of the Golden Dome Mosque. They've voted to call it Haram al-Sharif, which is the Muslim name, effectively disqualifying any reference to it as a Jewish site in history. Steve, I'll come to you first on this one, because it seems on the face of it a ridiculous thing to do, especially because not only is it a finger in the eye for the Jewish faith, but also Christianity from the times of Jesus. They're almost trying to wipe out any trace of that by acknowledging this type of a naming of the site.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can never understand why they do things like this, because it seems, at least on the face of it, so one-sided. And just swallowing the whole Muslim narrative, lock, stock, and barrel, without acknowledging that there's perhaps a Jewish or Christian claim to what we call in Israel the Temple Mount. Now, obviously, from an Israeli or Jewish perspective, all the archaeology done on the site has come up repeatedly with excavations from the Temple Mount period, the first Temple period, the second Temple period, to 2,000 years ago at the time of Jesus, showing that a lot of what the Bible says is in fact true, and that there was definitely a strong Jewish presence and later a Christian presence on the site. It seems to me that it would make so much more sense to acknowledge this. And I can never understand why United Nations bodies make these one-sided unilateral declarations to please one side. So I would urge just that there's some kind of sanity is restored, and that people understand that all three faiths have legitimate claims. It's not saying one faith is better than the other. One faith is control, they can support some kind of international resolution to the problem of the Jerusalem's old city and who the Al-Aqsa Temple Mount will finally belong to. But for now, the status quo seems to work, which is that it's in the hands of the Waqf, for the Palestinian Muslim Authority. Yes. Certainly, Jordan has a claim. It remains definitely part of that agreement of sovereignty of the Temple Mount, and Israel allows freedom of worship which has never been hasn't been allowed there for 2,000 years, both in the mosques and the Jewish at the Jewish sites below the Western Wall, etc. So, I would urge some kind of sanity. That World Jewish Congress tried to show that it supported the UN Secretary General this week by giving him a prize for his fight against anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, if you like. But I'm not sure that's the solution. You don't buy people off by giving them prizes. You have to try and find a way to come up with some kind of fair resolution.
And Benjamin, as we're looking at this discussion, we're seeing images from the headlines from UN Watch, which is an organization that does a very good job. A lot of people in Israel follow the work of UN Watch, who hold the UN's feet to the fire as regards Israel. The Jerusalem Post, also their story as well. Is there any way that the status quo is going to change as regards these votes? Just in the last week, there's been 7 resolutions against Israel, none against any of the other countries from the rest of the world, including some of the most despotic regimes, many of whom are on human rights councils at the UN. Are we ever going to see things change?
Well, Steve pointed to the one-sided or bias of the UN against Israel, and I think that's, as you're addressing right now, Paul, the major problem. And the only way to bring about change is from individual member states. Certainly the Western Europeans, who unfortunately most of them joined the jackals, so to speak, at the UN and voted against Israel in this recent round again. The Netherlands and other countries who have claim that they're concerned about bias at the UN targeting Israel, chose again to slam Israel. So I think countries like the United States could exert pressure on their allies in the West to reverse their voting pattern, their anti-Israeli voting pattern. Trump administration did do a lot of very good work in this area in terms of trying to reform the UN and trying to purge it of the institution of anti-Semitic elements. But there's a lot more work that needs to be done, and that would require a comprehensive pressure point campaign targeting Western European countries who then, if they decided to reverse their votes, could also use their leverage to convince other countries. But it's really just a wretched situation, and I think most folks are of the view right now that the UN is just a bottomless pit of anti-Israel hatred.
It appears that way more and more, and things don't seem to be improving. But we're very nearly out of time today. Just a very quick point before we go, because Israel came out of the lockdown in the last 10 days, gradually being rolled back at the lockdown. And I know a lot of people watching on will be from countries where they're already in the midst of a lockdown. And we were fortunate to be released. And I went to one of the places that makes me feel good about Israel. I went to Arbel Cliff, and you'll see 1 or 2 images of that. And went to Arbel Cliff, which overlooks the Galilee, an absolutely stunning place. For me, a place that many people visiting Israel should really go and see, because it has the most panoramic views and the most dramatic scenery. I just wondered very quickly from you two guys, when you are able to get out and about and do your thing, where's that special place for you that you would recommend people go see? Slightly off the beaten track, Steve.
Well, I've been in Israel for over 30 years, and I recently discovered a lovely place in Ramla, which is a city in central Israel, and it's just about half an hour from Tel Aviv, and it's open now during the lockdown, and we recently visited. It's called the Pool of Arches in Ramla. It's an underground reservoir where you can actually go in a little boat, and like in Venice, you go rowing through the reservoir, and it's really quite spectacular. It was built in 789. I just remember that because 789, and it's just a spectacular place to visit. It's very calm and relaxing. A perfect place to go in lockdown because I think you can only fit like 4 people in a boat.
So you've got your own pod. Yeah,
exactly. A capsule, I think we call it now.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I'm dating myself. Yeah.
And so I highly recommend it. If you can't actually visit it, then Google and have a look at it for yourself. It's really quite beautiful.
Well, a good suggestion. Ramleh, of course, is a city that is mixed Jewish, Muslim, Christian. And of course, it's also the site of the burial place of St. George, patron saint of England, and quite a lot of other places as well. Benjamin, your first port of call is somewhere to recommend to people that maybe they don't always get to when they come visit Israel.
Well, I would recommend, although there are tourists and it does attract a lot of visitors, Ein Bokek on the Dead Sea. And it's a place where there are major hotels, but it's also a location about 2 hours outside of Jerusalem where you can decompress. And if you have any skin conditions that require sun, it's a great place for healing. And as I said, to sort of purge your body of the toxins from your work life, I suspect. And there are wonderful restaurants. It depends on when you go there, but during the July-August period, it's very, very hot. The Dead Sea's water is almost, it feels like it's boiling. But if you like temperatures that are 25 degrees during that period, it's great. Or you can go when it's less humid, for example, in May, June. It's and float on the water in the Dead Sea. As I mentioned, it does attract tourists, but it's also filled with a lot of Israelis. So for visitors, you can also mingle with Israelis.
So good opportunity to do some Israeli watching there down at the Dead Sea, which is always time well spent and is an education in many different ways. Guys, thanks very much for joining us today on What the Israeli Papers Say. It's been a really interesting discussion. And Steve, thank you very much to you for joining us. I hope you'll come back.
Absolutely.
And as always, Benjamin Weinthal, thank you as well for your contribution.
Thanks, Paul.
And from me, Paul Alster, that's it for this time. We'll be back again next week with more of What the Israeli Papers Say here at Real Israel. And do remember as well to press the red subscribe button on the YouTube channel and to follow us on Twitter at real_Israel. But from me, Paul Alster, I'll say bye-bye and look forward to you joining us again next week. Bye-bye for now.